Chapter 29, Section 5, starting on page 11 of your notes. In the last section, we learned about the political and racial and economic policies of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In today's material, it's going to talk about the road to World War II, how actually their policies and beliefs actually led to that open conflict that we call the Second World War. The two themes that always dominated Hitler's thinking, particularly in his foreign policy, were the issues of living space, which the Germans called Lebensraum, and race. He always wanted to expand to the east to give Germans more living space. So Poland, the Soviet Union, these are areas that he had always looked at and said that's something that should be Germany in the future because Germans are a superior race and the Slavic people who live in Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, are an inferior race and they deserve to be conquered by Germany, a very social Darwinistic theme. The second theme of this period, and this is set between basically 1933, which is the beginning of the Nazi era, and then 1939, which is the start of the war, is that the Western nations, Western Europe, and to a greater extent, and the United States to a much lesser extent, pacified Hitler. They took a weak stand, most people argue historically, in all of his aggression, and they allowed him one thing after another to the point that he achieved so much and took over so much so quickly that once the war actually started, the Allies were at a serious disadvantage. And most historians believe that if the Western Allies had stood up to the Germans at some point early in the game, that perhaps the Second World War could have been avoided or made significantly less destructive. Section A, aggression and appeasement. So Hitler's work to accomplish his goals of living space and race. He was always crafty. He was always manipulating things. He would do things legally at first, but then illegally second to kind of catch people off guard. This is a classic move. The first thing he did that should have and did raise a lot of red flags for people was that he withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, October of 1933. He just simply said, we won't be a part of that organization. Now, that wasn't technically illegal. The Germans had the right to do that. So he backs out of the only international organization in the world at that time. The second thing he did, which was illegal, was that he renounced the Treaty of Versailles' disarmament policy toward Germany. The treaty had said Germany had to stay disarmed and unmobilized and ready and not ready for war at any point. So you can see that's almost a year and a half after the withdrawal from the League of Nations. So he could do all this because he had sort of pulled back from any international relationships already. The third thing, and this is just a long chain of things that the Germans do, is going to be called the Rhineland. So the Germans, remember the French, they wanted the buffer state known as the Rhineland on the borders of Germany and France, and the French didn't get that in the Treaty of Versailles, and so that area was kind of like a neutral area between the two nations. It wasn't an actual country, but it was a demilitarized zone after World War I. It's technically German territory, and so Hitler said, that's mine, and I'm going to reoccupy it. So he sent the German army, which was now back in action since 1935, since he renounced disarmament, and the German army goes into the Rhineland and reoccupies it. The response from the Western Allies was essentially condemnation, but unwillingness to really do anything about it. This is going to be the theme. They condemn his behavior, but really don't give any consequence for it. Very, very interesting. At this point, the Western Allies underestimated Hitler. They really thought that they could trust him. They thought that he was not as bad as he was going to be. He was seen as a potential ally against the Soviet Union and communism, which we were much more concerned about in the 1930s than fascism. Particularly the British were very eager to work with Germany, and they were more concerned about what was going on in Stalin's Russia than in Central Europe and Germany. So there was they misread him, and they just never quite thought he was as bad as he was. The third issue, Hitler forges alliances. So his main alliance is going to be ultimately with the Italians, but it starts off with Italy doing something sort of unusual. They took over, this is Mussolini now, the last open territory, or second to last open territory in Africa. There was Liberia and Ethiopia, and Mussolini said the Italians deserve a colonial empire. This is 1936. Europeans haven't been taking colonies, anything new, since 1880 in the Berlin Conference. So this is many, many decades later, but there was that one territory left. And Ethiopia was a fairly strong, independent nation run by a very famous man named Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia. Now they couldn't stand up to the modern, vicious Italian army. Hitler promised his support to Mussolini if he wanted to take over Ethiopia in Mussolini's effort to build a new Roman Empire or something like that. Haile Selassie is the Emperor of Ethiopia. He came to the League of Nations, which was in Switzerland, I believe, the headquarters, and he gave a famous speech in which he basically said, if you, the international world, don't come to our help in Ethiopia, you're next. It was kind of a prophetic vision of the future. And the League of Nations had no response to his speech, and they refused military assistance to Ethiopia, and Mussolini took it over. Now, on a side note, this particular man, Haile Selassie, is believed in the Rastafarian movement to be the god, and he is worshipped as a god. At that time, in many parts of Central America, in the Rastafarian movement, they thought this guy was God, and he actually never said that he wasn't. So there's sort of another side issue here with this guy that goes on independent of these political activities in Europe and Africa. So the result, this was sort of like Mussolini's time to prove himself to Hitler that he was serious about conquering things, and then they became very close, and they signed a famous pact called the Rome-Berlin Axis. This is the name of the formal alliance between Italy and Germany, and this is going to go into World War II, which is why we get the term Axis powers to describe Germany, and Allied powers, obviously, to describe the rest of us. Japan's going to join the Rome-Berlin Axis later as we move much closer to the beginning of the First World War, but Hitler and Mussolini started making public appearances together, going into parades and these kind of events, and it was very evident that they were brothers in fascism from this point forward. The next major development in the road to World War II is the Spanish Civil War. So there was a civil war in Spain for 3 years between fascist forces that wanted to overthrow the existing liberal government in Spain and replace it with a fascist-style government, much like Italy and Germany. On the opposing side are what we would call the Republicans, the left wing, who believed in the democracy that was already in place. This Civil War turns into what we call like a dress rehearsal for World War II, because all of the nations in Europe that will eventually participate in World War II participate in the Spanish Civil War. Everybody gets involved in this one way or another. And the Allies, the non-fascist nations, thought that if they could stop fascism from spreading into Spain, then that would put a check on what Hitler and Mussolini were doing, and maybe it would stop aggression. Germany and Italy, the fascist nations of Europe, intervened in the Spanish Civil War to help the fascist revolutionaries. And they intervened very, very heavily through military forces, air forces, weaponry. They did just about everything except send troops in themselves. And then to respond to that, the Republican side was supported by everyone else in the world that isn't fascist. So even the Soviet Union and the Americans joined the Republican side in the Civil War as well. There was a whole brigade of American soldiers that willingly signed up to go and fight in the Spanish Civil War, and we call those guys the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. It was mainly left-wing Americans, communist Americans, which was actually a quite popular political movement in the 1930s in the U.S., and they joined with their Soviet counterpart, their brothers in arms, and there was this international presence in the Spanish Civil War where all these nations sent people and troops and weapons to try to stop or advance the spread of fascism in that war. One of the most famous events in the Spanish Civil War is when the German Air Force, called the Luftwaffe, bombed a town called Guernica. And that is one of the most famous examples of an attack on civilians. There were no military targets in the town of Guernica. It was simply to threaten and terrorize the people that were supporting the Republican government in Spain. So they killed thousands of innocent civilians. The German army invading, it was flying over Spain, bombing in this bombing attack. This is the famous proof that the fascists are going to attack civilians, and that World War II is really going to be just as much about a war against civilians as it is about military targets. So the famous commemoration or memorial of this attack is Pablo Picasso's painting, which has the same title. This is on page 935. You can see it in the book. It's also right here, and I think many of you have studied this in Spanish class. And so it depicts the atrocities of the attack on civilians. This is a very famous painting. Picasso, being a Spaniard, was deeply touched by what he had seen in the Spanish Civil War. Picasso was a supporter of the left-wing Republican government in Spain. So the result of the Spanish Civil War is that with the help of Germany particularly, the fascists win, and they install a dictator named Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who is going to rule Spain all the way to 1975, long after fascists and everywhere else in Europe were defeated. General Franco ruled Spain as sort of a half-hearted effort at fascism. He was never as bloodthirsty or brutal to the people of Spain as the Germans and the Italians were. He was sort of like a petty dictator, but nevertheless rules until 1975, long time. Next event, the Germans go back to their work of conquest. They annexed Austria in what's known as the Anschluss. Annexation means we just simply take it over and declare it part of the German Empire. March of 1938. This is a picture of Hitler and the Nazi army in Vienna. Invading is not maybe the right word. They were welcomed by the people of Austria. This was a peaceful annexation. In fact, the Germans and the Austrians said it's a reunification. We really should have been one empire the whole time. We're now that empire again. This is reconstituting essentially the World War I alliance between Germany and Austria. Again, they were highly welcomed by the people of Austria. This is why when the international community protested, Hitler said, "How can you deny this to us when the people of Austria have all said that they agree?" And to make it look legitimate, let me get rid of this. To make it look legitimate, Hitler gave a plebiscite, a vote, and here's the ballot that was given to the people of Austria to vote for the Anschluss or not. And the text says here, it says on the 13th of March 1938, which is the date of the election, Wiedervereinigung, which means reunification of Österreichs mit dem Deutschen Reich. So the reunification of Austria with the German Empire. And the vote, Adolf Hitler, question mark, ja, nein. And you're going to put ja. You're going to say yes to that. And just look at that's so funny to me that the circles were written like that. This is a classic tool of dictators. This is what Napoleon would do, yes or no. This is what future dictators in the Middle East would do. You're going to vote yes on this ballot. Okay? Not a fair election. The next issue is known as the Sudetenland crisis or the Czech crisis. There was an area on the western part of Czechoslovakia in yellow that you can see on this map where there was a bunch of German speakers. And Czechoslovakia was a new country created after World War I by the delegates at the Treaty of Versailles, Paris Peace Conference. And as they drew the map and borders of the new Czechoslovakia, they included in the western portion a significant number of German-speaking people. And this was a problem for Hitler because he says there's Germans now being ruled by Slavic people, Czechs, and Czechoslovakia is a Slavic nation as an ethnic group. Because that's not right for Slavic people to be ruling Germans. I demand that I be given the Sudetenland. That's Germany. There's German people there. It's Germany. This became a huge international issue because the people of the Sudetenland were in favor of becoming Germans, but this was territory from another nation that did not want to give it up. This was not a peaceful thing. The Anschluss with Austria was peaceful. This was not. This issue was resolved, or at least they attempted to resolve it, at a famous international meeting called the Munich Conference, held in September of 1938. And it's all about the Sudetenland. And here's the cast of characters at that meeting. Right in the middle, of course, is Hitler. To his right is Mussolini. To the left of Hitler is the French Prime Minister named Daladier, and to the left of him was the British Prime Minister, whose name was Neville Chamberlain. These, particularly the four men that I just noted, are the main main negotiators at the meeting. And of course, Hitler said, "I want this territory," and there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion. Here's Neville Chamberlain talking to Mussolini, and I always find this to be a funny picture because there's Chamberlain with his pocket watch and his three-piece suit, reasoning and being rational, no doubt, and appealing to logic and common sense and the sense of fairness. And then there's Mussolini looking like kind of a crazy man with his military outfit, like he's about to bite this guy's face off. The fascist dictators were not willing to budge on the Sudetenland issue, and the settlement that they came up with, shocking, is that Hitler could have the Sudetenland. They said, "You can take that, but that's it. Promise us that you won't take over any more territory in Europe. If we give you the Sudetenland, will that be it for you?" And Hitler said, "Yes, of course, that's as much as I'll take." So the Western Allies practiced appeasement. They appeased Hitler. They gave him what he wanted. Some people say it was a cave-in. Some people say it was weak. But Chamberlain thought it was a great victory. And he came back to London and he held up the treaty that was signed, a document from the Munich Conference. Here he is coming off his airplane. And he said, "I have achieved peace in our time. We have achieved it. We've secured peace in our time." Famous last words. That phrase, that speech, it was going to come back to haunt him for decades in the future. People still think of Chamberlain as the guy that gave away Eastern Europe to the Nazis because Hitler didn't stop there. Well, in fact, Chamberlain was the Time magazine either Person of the Week or Person of the Month or some sort of commemoration. This guy was, for a very brief moment, considered the peacemaker of Europe. And of course, that's all going to fall apart. And it fell apart about 6 months later. So the Germans took over the Sudetenland in September of 1938. And by March of 1939, so just a few short months later, Germany just flat out invaded all of Czechoslovakia and conquered it. And now the people in Czechoslovakia are not German. The Sudeten Germans are German, but everyone else in Czechoslovakia is Czech. So now this is the first time that Hitler has conquered a non-German speaking people. And this was war. And so the rest of the world is waiting for this. You see this cartoon. This is how the Czechs feel about what happened at the Munich conference as these Western... Oh, by the way, nobody asked the Czech government if it was okay if Hitler took over the Sudetenland. The Czech government was not at the Munich conference negotiating. Britain and France were speaking for Czechoslovakia against Czechoslovakia's will. And so here they're feeding their nation up to the German wolf. So at this point, the Europeans know that war is inevitable, but they're not ready for it. So there's this long waiting period from March of 1939 through the summer to August 1939. And in those few months, there was kind of a quiet period, but the Germans did something that shocked the world. Hitler went to Stalin, and they used diplomats, different guys named Ribbentrop and Molotov, and they signed a non-aggression pact. The Germans and the Soviets made an alliance together right in August of 1939, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And the fascists were sworn enemies of communists and vice versa. So for them to make this agreement shocked the U.S. and Britain and France. We thought these people would never, never do this. And the common bond that they had was that they each wanted to take part of Eastern Europe. The Germans wanted living space in the east. The Soviets wanted expansion toward the west in the areas that they had lost to Germany in World War I. So they sort of agreed that they would divide Eastern Europe together. They were going to take away Poland again, just like in the 18th century with the partition of Poland. They basically agreed. All of this was done in secret. To the Western Allies, this amounted to treachery because we thought we had had an alliance with the Soviet Union, at least against fascism potentially. And this famous political cartoon sort of says it all, where Hitler and Stalin become, you know, unbelievable friends, or just shocking that they would do this. The scum of the earth, I believe, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. So this is really one of the most unholy alliances of all time. So less than a month after the Non-Aggression Pact is signed, Germany invaded the western half of Poland to take their part, and part of the agreement was that if once the war break, once the Germans and the Soviets invade Eastern Europe, they won't fight each other. That was the terms of their treaty. So at this point, this is now the second country that Hitler invaded. First Czechoslovakia, then Poland, September 1st, 1939, and World War II officially begins on that day. That's when the British, the French, and everyone else openly declared war on Hitler. The United States does not. You know that. We don't join the war until 1941 after Pearl Harbor. So for the first 2 years of the war, it's just Western Europe versus Germany. And Hitler's going to go on a barrage of conquest in the early years of the war, and he's going to get to Paris and take over all of France very rapidly. And we will study World War II and the famous events and battles of the war during class on the first days of next week. So we'll stop for there.